She stood in the middle of that town square with flowers still dusting her hands, wearing a dress she'd sewn herself from feed sacks, and every single person in Dust Creek was laughing. Every person except one. The man who stepped forward wasn't supposed to choose her. Nobody was. Clara Whitmore was the girl they used, the girl they forgot, the girl who kept her family fed while they treated her like a workhorse with no feelings and no future. But one quiet, unreadable rancher was about to change everything, and the town would never recover from what she became. Stay with us until the very end, because this story only gets more powerful from here. If this is your first time finding our channel, hit subscribe and become part of our family. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And drop a like, then tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The bread had been burning since before sunrise. Clara Whitmore knew it the moment she pulled open the oven door. That particular smell, not quite scorched, but heading there fast. And she'd already been awake for 4 hours by then. She yanked the loaves out with a cloth that was too thin for the job, felt the heat bite through to her palms, and set them on the rack without making a sound. She'd learned not to make sounds. Sounds drew attention. Attention drew complaints. Complaints were the one thing in Dust Creek that never seemed to run short. Outside, the town was still sleeping. The sky above the main street was that bruised gray color it got right before the sun committed to rising, and the only light in the Whitmore bakery came from the oven itself and one candle stub on the work table. Clara moved between them by feel more than sight. She knew the angles of this room the way she knew her own breathing. Without thinking, without choosing, just knowing. She was 23 years old and had not left Dust Creek once in her life. The front door rattled. Clara turned, already knowing who it was before the latch lifted. Her sister Nora came in like she owned the air the room breathed, a silk wrap around her shoulders even at this hour, hair already pinned with some kind of care that Clara didn't have the time or energy to name. Behind her was the younger one, Iris, who was 17 and had already mastered the particular look of someone who expects the world to arrange itself pleasingly around them. "Is the bread done?" Nora asked, not looking at Clara. She was looking at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. "Almost. Father said it should be done by now." "It'll be ready when it's ready." Nora finally glanced at her. A quick measuring look, the kind you'd give a piece of furniture you were trying to decide whether to replace. "You've got something on your face." Clara didn't touch her face. "Flour." "Obviously." Nora turned back to the window. This was how most mornings started. It wasn't cruelty exactly, or if it was the kind so long practiced it had stopped feeling like cruelty to anyone involved. It had just become the shape of things. Clara was the one who woke early. Clara was the one with flour on her face. Clara was the one who smelled like the oven and had rough hands and moved through the bakery like a woman who had learned to shrink herself into whatever space was left after everything else was accounted for. Nora and Iris were beautiful. Everyone in Dust Creek knew it and said so regularly, which the two of them accepted with the calm certainty of people who have never had reason to doubt it. Their father, Thomas Whitmore, was a man who believed a woman's worth moved in direct proportion to her beauty, and so he treated his daughters accordingly. Nora and Iris like something fragile and valuable that needed protection and display, and Clara like something sturdy and useful that needed to keep working. The fact that Clara had kept the bakery running for the past 3 years while Thomas himself managed mostly to sit in the front room and discuss local politics with whoever wandered in, this was not a fact that altered the arithmetic in Thomas's head. Clara ran the ovens. Clara managed the accounts. Clara negotiated with the flour supplier when he came in trying to overcharge them, and she had twice now gotten him to back down just by knowing the numbers better than he did. None of that made her beautiful. So none of that particularly mattered in her father's reckoning. By the time full light came in through the windows and the first customers began moving up the street outside, Clara had pulled 4 more loaves, started 24 rolls, cleaned the work table, and restocked the flour from the storage room in the back. She did all of it without anyone asking. Nora had drifted back upstairs. Iris had fallen asleep in the chair near the door. Clara stepped around her sister's outstretched feet without comment and went to unlock the front. The first customer was old Hetty Marsh, who bought one loaf every morning and complained about the price every morning with the practiced dedication of someone who had turned complaint into a kind of hobby. Clara wrapped the loaf, took the coins, said good morning, and moved on. The second customer was someone's ranch hand, there for a crate of rolls to take out to the bunkhouse. He counted out his money with dirty fingers and barely looked at Clara at all, which was fine. She wasn't looking for conversation. The third customer was different. She heard him before she saw him, not because he was loud, but because the other people in the room got quieter when he came through the door. That was the kind of entrance it was. Not showy, just weighted. Ethan Blackwood was not, in the conventional Dust Creek sense, a man who tried to take up space. He was quiet the way that certain things in the natural world were quiet. Not because there was nothing there, but because whatever was there didn't feel the need to announce itself. He was broad through the shoulders and wore his clothes like a man who bought for function and hadn't spent much time thinking beyond that. His face was weathered, not old, and he had a way of looking at a room that made it feel like he'd already decided what he thought of it before he'd stepped fully inside. Clara had seen him in town a handful of times. Ethan Blackwood owned the largest working ranch in the county, which was a fact everyone mentioned when they mentioned him, the same way they mentioned that the mountains were tall. It was background information, part of the landscape. He came to the counter. Morning. Morning. Clara reached under the counter for the order ledger. You placing an order? Looking to? He set his hat on the counter edge. Need a standing order. Rolls twice a week. Out to the ranch. How many hands? 12. Sometimes more during season. Clara did the calculation without thinking about it, wrote it down, gave him the price. He looked at the number, nodded, didn't argue. You're the one who runs this place, he said. It wasn't a question exactly. Clara looked up. I work here. He nodded again like he'd confirmed something to himself. Then he picked up his hat, said he'd send someone in to settle the account, and left. Clara watched him go. Then she went back to the rolls. She didn't think much more about it that morning. There was too much else requiring her attention. The afternoon bake, the inventory, the letter from the flour supplier that she needed to answer, the fact that the oven door's lower hinge was beginning to loosen and she'd need to fix it before it became a real problem. These were the things that filled her days. Not ranchers, not standing orders, not whatever it was Nora and Iris spent their hours dreaming about. That evening, after the last customer was gone and the fire was banked and the flour sacks restacked and the whole mechanical routine of the bakery put to rest for another night, Clara sat down in the storage room with the door pulled almost closed and took out the sketchbook. It was an old thing, bound in brown leather that had been soft once and was stiff now, and she kept it behind the third row of flour sacks where nobody went except her. She turned to a page near the middle. Not the first blank page, not a random one, but a specific page she'd returned to so many times the paper was starting to thin at the corners. And she looked at what she'd drawn. A dress. Not the kind of dress Nora wore, with its silk and its careful imported lace. Something different. Something that accounted for the way women here actually lived, the way they bent and lifted and worked and moved, but that also gave them a kind of dignity, a line to the shoulder, and a fall to the skirt that made them feel like something other than people enduring. Clara could see it in her head so clearly, it was almost like looking at a real object. She could feel the fabric choices, the way certain weaves would drape and others wouldn't, the places where a seam could be reinforced without showing, the places where a small kindness in the cut could make a woman stand differently without even knowing why. She started sketching. She taught herself years ago from a book she'd borrowed and never returned from the traveling goods merchant who'd passed through when she was 14. He'd left a crate of books behind in trade for a month's worth of bread, and Clara had taken the one on cloth and pattern making and read it so many times the spine gave out. She'd taught herself to sketch from the illustrations, taught herself the vocabulary of darts and gussets and bias cuts, and for about 6 months when she was 16, she'd made 3 dresses that she thought were genuinely good. She'd made the mistake of showing them. The town's reaction hadn't been outright cruel, though it could have been. It had been something almost worse, amused, indulgent, like someone watching a large dog try to navigate a narrow hallway. Clara Whitmore, trying to be a seamstress. Clara Whitmore, who was built for hauling sacks and stoking fires, standing there with these dresses she'd made, trying to be something she wasn't meant to be. One woman, a merchant's wife whose opinion carried weight in Dust Creek, had looked at the dresses and then looked at Clara and said, quite pleasantly, "They're lovely, dear, but who do you imagine is going to buy a dress from you?" Clara had taken the dresses home, folded them neatly, and put them in the trunk at the foot of her bed. She hadn't made another one since, but the sketches never stopped. She drew for about an hour that evening, just letting the pencil move. She wasn't designing for anyone. She wasn't designing for any purpose. She just drew because the part of her that needed to do this didn't care whether anyone was going to see it. She drew until her hand cramped and she had to stop, and then she sat for a while looking at the page. Then she heard her father's voice from the front room, talking to someone, and she tucked the sketchbook back behind the flour sacks and stood up and smoothed her apron. The next morning was when things began to change. Her father came down earlier than usual, which was unusual enough to put Clara on alert. He was dressed in his going-to-town clothes, which meant something was happening that he considered worth his attention, and he had that particular expression he got when he was anticipating something. Not quite eager, not quite satisfied, somewhere in between. "There's a gathering at the square today," he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot Clara had already made. "Judge's announcement." "What kind of announcement?" Thomas waved a hand. "Marriage business. The judge is trying to settle some of the ranching disputes by getting the cattlemen and the townspeople more tied together. Wants to set up a matching." Clara kept her hands moving, turning dough. "A matching?" "A bride selection." He said it like it was the most practical thing in the world. "Cowboys with land, girls from town families. Judge thinks it'll smooth things over between the ranchers and the settlers if they're more intermarried." Clara looked up. "And we're going." "Your sisters are going?" He picked up his coffee. "You'll come along too. Make it look like the family's participating." She understood what that meant. She would stand in the line to fulfill the number. Nora and Iris would actually be chosen. Claire would come back to the bakery. She'd known this scenario, or something like it, her whole life. The one where she was included just enough to fill a gap someone else needed filled, but not actually expected to factor into the outcome. She turned back to the dough. "Fine. Be presentable," her father said. She looked down at her apron. "I'll do what I can." The square was crowded by mid-morning. Clara could feel the texture of it before they even got there. The buzz of it. The way people were talking faster than usual. The self-consciousness of women who'd clearly spent time on their appearances, and the studied casualness of the men who were pretending they hadn't done the same. Nora had worn her best dress, the blue silk one that caught light in a way that made people stop and look. Iris was in cream and yellow and had done something elaborate to her hair that had taken the better part of the morning. Clara was in a dress she'd made herself out of practical gray-brown linen, and she'd brushed her hair and left it at that. There were about 15 women in the selection line. Clara took a place near the end, out of habit. The judge, a heavy-set man named Aldridge, who took his own authority very seriously, stood on the courthouse steps and explained the arrangement to the assembled crowd. Ranchers would select, town families would agree, the judge would formalize the arrangement. It was presented as a community solution to a community problem, which was one way to describe it. The ranchers stood in a loose group to one side. Clara counted maybe a dozen of them, ranging from young and nervous-looking to older and deliberate. She recognized some of them. She recognized Ethan Blackwood, standing a little apart from the others, watching the proceedings with the same expression he'd worn in her bakery the day before, measured, attentive, having already decided something she wasn't privy to. The selection began. It went the way Clara expected. The men moved forward one at a time, and the pattern was predictable. The women toward the front of the line, the ones who'd clearly prepared for this moment, they went quickly. There was something uncomfortable about watching it, though she couldn't have articulated it beyond a vague sense that everyone involved was pretending this was more dignified than it was. But she stayed where she was. She'd agreed to come. She'd stand here. Nora was chosen fourth. A rancher named Caldwell, not young but solid, stepped up and said her name, and Nora stepped forward with a smile that landed exactly where she'd aimed it. Iris was chosen shortly after, by someone whose name Clara didn't catch, and Iris went with the easy confidence of someone who had simply expected to be picked. The line got shorter. Clara stood. The crowd's attention moved around her the way water moves around a rock. She was aware of this. Not hurt by it exactly, but aware. She'd had a lot of practice being the one the attention moved around. 3 women left in the line, then 2, then just Clara. She heard someone near her murmur something to someone else. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, which was enough. And then she heard footsteps. She looked up. Ethan Blackwood was walking toward her. He didn't look at the ground. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her with that same directness she'd seen in the bakery, that measuring quality that somehow wasn't unkind. And he stopped in front of her. Around them, the square had gone quiet, in the particular way that things go quiet when no one wants to miss what happens next. "I choose her," he said. He said it to the judge. He said it clearly and without hesitation, without the qualifier or the apology that the crowd's silence seemed to be waiting for. Clara stood absolutely still. For a moment, she couldn't read the expression on his face. It wasn't pity. She'd have recognized pity, had a finely tuned awareness of it from years of practice. It wasn't some kind of point he was making to the crowd. It was just a decision, a settled, considered decision. The crowd broke into noise. She heard pieces of it: surprise, confusion, the amused speculation that was this town's favorite sport. She heard her father's voice from somewhere behind her, higher than usual, saying something she couldn't make out. She looked at Ethan Blackwood and said the only thing she could think to say. "You sure about that?" The edge of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Yes." Clara let out a breath, looked at the ground for just a second, then looked back up. "All right then." The judge recorded the arrangement. People moved and talked, and the square began to reassemble itself into the ordinary shape of a morning, and Clara stood in the middle of it feeling like something had shifted under her feet without her having taken a single step. Across the crowd, she caught her father's eye. He was not pleased, not because he cared anything about her happiness or her future. He was not pleased because he'd just watched his most reliable worker agree to leave his bakery, and the look on his face said he was already calculating what that would cost him. Clara looked back at him for a long moment. Then she turned away. Nobody said anything to Clara directly. That was the thing about Dust Creek. People rarely said anything directly. They talked around you, talked near you, talked about you while you were standing close enough to hear. It was a particular skill the town had developed, the way certain climates grow certain plants, and Clara had spent enough years inside it to know exactly when she was the subject of a conversation, even when no one was facing her. The walk home from the square was short and felt longer than it was. Her father moved ahead of her without speaking, his back carrying the stiffness of a man who had decided what he thought and was letting the silence do the work for him. Nora walked beside him, her blue silk dress catching the afternoon light, and she was talking in that low, careful tone she used when she wanted to say something pointed without seeming to. Iris trailed behind, glancing at Clara with an expression somewhere between curiosity and discomfort, like she was watching something she didn't know how to categorize. Clara didn't try to keep up with any of them. She walked at her own pace, carrying the strange new weight of the morning, and when she got home she went straight to the bakery and started the afternoon bake, because that was what needed doing. She was halfway through shaping the second batch when her father came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work. Then he said, "You don't have to go." Clara didn't stop moving. "The judge formalized it. Arrangements can be undone." She picked up the next piece of dough. "Why would I undo it?" Thomas crossed his arms. He had a way of making his posture into an argument, filling a doorway like he thought the width of him made his points more persuasive. "Because we need you here. You know that. The girls can't run this place on their own." "The girls don't run it now," Clara said, and she kept her voice flat because she knew if she let any feeling into it, he'd work with that feeling the way he worked with everything, turning it into evidence for his position. "Don't be difficult." "I'm not being difficult. I'm pointing out that nothing changes if I leave except you'll have to find someone else to do the work." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Blackwood's a cold man. People say he ran his last ranch foreman off the property. You don't know what you're walking into." Clara glanced up at that. Her father's face had shifted, not to concern exactly, but to something adjacent to it, and she couldn't tell if it was genuine or if it was simply the next tool in the box after silence hadn't worked. "I'll manage," she said. He left without another word. Clara finished shaping the dough and slid the trays into the oven and stood in the quiet of the bakery for a moment, listening to the sound of the fire. She was not, she told herself, doing this because she thought Ethan Blackwood was going to save her from anything. She had spent too many years watching women in this town wait to be saved to put much stock in that particular plan. She was doing it because the alternative was staying here, in this room, with flour on her hands and nothing changing, until she was 40 and then 50, and then simply too tired to imagine anything different. That was the honest version of it, and Clara had always preferred honest. She left for the Blackwood Ranch 8 days later. Ethan sent a wagon. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the man driving it, a ranch hand named Obese, who was somewhere north of 60 and had a jaw like a fence post and very little interest in conversation, which suited Clara fine. She loaded her 2 trunks herself. Her father watched from the doorway of the bakery without offering to help. Nora stood at the upstairs window. Iris, to her credit, came outside and stood in the yard. "You could write," Iris said. She said it awkwardly, like someone trying out a phrase in a foreign language. "I could," Clara agreed. Iris opened her mouth to say something else, then closed it. She looked at her feet, then back at Clara. "He's not... people don't really know him that well." "I know." "Are you scared?" Clara thought about it for a second, actually considered the question instead of reflexively answering it. "A little," she said. "Not enough to stay." Iris nodded like that made sense to her, though Clara doubted it did. They looked at each other for a moment, 2 people who had shared a roof for 23 years and never quite found the footing for anything real between them. And then Clara climbed up onto the wagon seat. The road out of Dust Creek was dry, and ruts ran through it from years of wagon wheels, and Clara sat straight and watched the town get smaller behind her, and didn't let herself feel what she felt until it was small enough that it couldn't see her face. The Blackwood Ranch was 12 miles east, where the land opened up from the scrub and hardpack of the town's outskirts into something wider. When they came over the last rise and she saw it laid out below her, the main house, the barns, the fenced pastures extending further than she could see, her first thought was that it was bigger than she'd imagined. Her second thought was that it looked like serious work had been done here, the kind of work that accrues over years and doesn't announce itself. Ethan was in the yard when the wagon came in. He had his sleeves rolled to the elbow and was talking to someone about a fence line, and he finished the conversation before he walked over. He helped her down from the wagon, a practical gesture, nothing theatrical about it, and then he stood back and looked at her with that same directness she'd seen twice now. "Long ride," he said. "Not so bad." He nodded. "I'll show you the house." The house was clean and sparse and entirely functional. It had what it needed and not much beyond that. A good iron stove, a solid table, curtains that had probably been hung by someone with more decorating impulse than Ethan himself and then forgotten about. Clara walked through it with him at her side, and he named the rooms and their purposes in a voice that was informational rather than welcoming, and she respected that because it was honest. "The room at the end is yours," he said. "If you need anything for it, tell me." Clara looked into the room. A bed, a chest of drawers, a window facing east. Enough. "It's fine," she said. There was a pause, the kind that happens when 2 people who don't know each other are trying to determine the rules of their coexistence. "I want to be straight with you," Ethan said. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, but it wasn't the aggressive crossed arms of her father. It was just a man thinking while his hands were otherwise occupied. "I didn't choose you at that square because I needed someone to cook or clean. I've got men who handle most of that." Clara waited. "I chose you because you run a business. You understand accounts. I need someone who can manage the books for this place because I'm better with cattle than numbers, and last year I nearly undersold the whole spring herd because I trusted a buyer I should have questioned." He paused. "That's the practical part. The other part is that it's a legal arrangement, and I'll treat it like one, which means I'll treat you decently." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "That's a more honest speech than I expected. Would you have preferred something less honest?" "No." "Then we understand each other." She almost said something else. She stopped herself, sorted through what she actually wanted to say, and said it. "I appreciate that you told me the reason. Most people would have let me guess." He looked at her like he was recalculating something. Then he pushed off the doorframe and said, "Supper's at 6, and walked back down the hallway, and Clara stood in the doorway of her room and thought that whatever this arrangement was, it was at least going to be legible. The first 2 weeks were hard in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated. Not hard because anything was cruel or obviously wrong. Hard because adjustment is hard. And because the ranch operated on a rhythm she didn't know yet. And because there were 12 ranch hands who had their own opinions about who she was and why she was there, and those opinions varied in useful ways. Some of the men were indifferent, a couple were politely curious, and two of them, brothers named Lyle and Doyle Whitaker, had clearly decided that her presence was an inconvenience and weren't particularly interested in hiding it. She heard them the third morning, talking near the water trough while she was coming back from checking the chicken run. Lyle's voice carried. "Don't see why he needed to bring a town woman out here. What does she even know about ranch work?" "She knows numbers," he said. That was Doyle, who apparently had at least some fidelity to factual accuracy. "Numbers." Lyle made a sound. "We managed the accounts before. We managed them badly, which is why Henderson nearly took us for the whole spring sale." A pause, then, "Still." Clara filed this away without changing her pace or her expression. This was information, same as any other kind, and she'd learned early that information was more useful when people didn't know you had it. The accounts were genuinely a mess, not catastrophic. The ranch was profitable, and Ethan had good instincts for the business of cattle. But the record-keeping had the quality of something done by someone who understood what needed tracking, but not how to track it in a way that would serve him over time. She spent 3 days going through the ledgers, making notes, cross-referencing with the supply orders and the sale records, and at the end of it, she sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table and walked him through what she'd found. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of which were good questions. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers she'd laid out, and then he said, "I lost more on that Henderson deal than I thought." "More than you thought, but less than you would have lost next time if you hadn't caught it." He looked up. "Is that you being optimistic?" "That's me being accurate." She paused. "I can fix the system. It'll take a few weeks to get it sorted properly, but after that it should be straightforward to maintain." "All right. I'll need you to actually tell me when you make a sale or a major purchase, even if it seems small." "All right. And the Harmon supply contract needs to be renegotiated. You're paying too much for winter feed." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Harmon's been the supplier here for 8 years." "I know. And for 8 years you've been paying a rate that made sense in the first year and hasn't been adjusted since. Prices changed. He kept billing you the same way because you kept paying it." Something moved across his face. Not quite annoyance, not quite amusement. He looked at the ledger sheet open in front of him. "You noticed that in 3 days." "I noticed things." He nodded slowly. "I'll talk to Harmon." "I can come." He looked at her. "I negotiated supply contracts for my father's bakery for 3 years, she said. "I know how to do it." There was a pause that Clara didn't try to fill. She'd learned that Ethan's pauses weren't uncertainty. They were processing, which was different. "Fine," he said. "Come." The Harmon negotiation happened the following Tuesday and went better than Clara had expected, mostly because Mr. Harmon was a man who respected preparation, and Clara showed up with 3 years of his own invoices and the current regional pricing on winter feed, and there wasn't much left for him to argue with. Ethan sat beside her and said almost nothing, which was the right call. And when they drove back out to the ranch, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You've done that before." "I told you I had." "I know, I believed you. I just didn't know what it would look like." Clara looked out at the passing land. "What did it look like?" "Like you knew exactly what you were doing and weren't interested in anybody's opinion about it." She considered this. "Is that a problem?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "It's not a problem at all." She went back to the books that evening, and the evening after that, and slowly the picture of the ranch's finances came into focus in a way that it apparently hadn't for years. It was satisfying in the way that untangling things is satisfying. Not glamorous, not the kind of work that anyone would look at and think was impressive, but solid, real, something that would hold. She found to her surprise that she liked the evenings on the ranch in a way she hadn't liked evenings in a long time. The quality of the silence was different here. In her father's bakery, the silence after closing had always felt like a held breath, like the building itself was waiting for the next morning's demands to start. Out here, the quiet was just quiet. The land absorbed it and gave it back in a form that felt less pressured. She began, in those evenings, to take the sketchbook out again. Not hiding it, exactly, but not advertising it either. Sitting at the small table in her room with the lamp lit, drawing the way she'd always drawn, because the part of her that needed to do it didn't care what else was happening in her life. She drew practical dresses with good waistlines. She drew work clothes that had some dignity in them. She drew evening things that were probably entirely impractical for Dust Creek, but that existed in her head fully formed and wanted out. One evening, she'd left the sketchbook open on the table when Ethan knocked on the open door of her room. He'd come to tell her something about a supply delivery the next morning, and he told her, and then his eyes went to the table. She watched him look at the sketchbook. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at it the way he'd looked at the accounting ledgers. Not politely, not with the vague appreciation of someone making an effort, but actually looking. "Did you do these?" he asked. "Yes." He walked over to the table without asking, which surprised her, and stood looking at the open page. Then he turned back a page. Then another. Clara stayed where she was. She was aware of a tightness in her chest that she recognized as the specific feeling of waiting for someone to laugh. He didn't laugh. "These are good," he said. He turned another page. "This one. Is this supposed to be practical or decorative?" She came and stood beside him, looking at the page. "Both. The seams reinforced here. See?" She pointed, her finger hovering just above the paper. "So it holds up in real use. But the line here gives it shape. You don't have to sacrifice one for the other if you think it through properly." He was quiet. "Most people don't think it's worth the effort," she said. "For working women out here, I mean. The thinking gets done ahead of time, and the conclusion is usually, function is enough." "That's lazy thinking," Ethan said. Clara blinked. He set the book back down carefully. "Function and dignity aren't opposites." He straightened, and there was something in his voice that was too considered to be casual. "You should do something with these." She looked at him. "I tried that once." "What happened?" "People laughed." He looked back at the sketchbook, then at her. His expression didn't offer her sympathy exactly, but it also wasn't dismissive, and it wasn't the careful neutrality of someone who didn't have an opinion. He had an opinion. She just couldn't fully read it yet. "People laugh at things they don't understand," he said. "Doesn't make the thing less real." He left, and Clara stood in her room looking at the sketchbook on the table, and something she'd packed very carefully into a box inside herself a long time ago shifted, just slightly, just enough that she noticed, and she was not sure yet what to do with that. She reached out and turned to a new page and picked up her pencil. The pencil kept moving even after the lamp burned low. Claire had learned over the years to work in whatever light was available: bakery mornings before dawn, storage rooms with one candle stub, the gray, uncertain light of a sky that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. Her eyes had adjusted to making do. So she kept drawing until the wick gave out and the room went dark, and then she sat in the dark for a while with the sketchbook closed in her lap and thought about what Ethan had said. Doesn't make the thing less real. She'd had people say kind things to her before, or what passed for kind, the careful encouragement of someone who felt obligated, the performative praise that had a ceiling on it, the kind that translated roughly to, "This is fine for someone like you." She knew the difference between that and a man who had looked at something with his actual attention and said what he thought. She was still figuring out what to do with the difference. The ranch in October had a quality she hadn't expected. She'd assumed it would feel emptier out here than in town, less animated, but the opposite turned out to be true. The land was doing things constantly, moving through its seasons in ways that the tight grid of Dust Creek streets didn't leave room for. The grasses changed color by the week. The light hit the morning pastures at angles that shifted daily. There was noise at all hours: cattle, wind, the particular creak of the big barn's east door that nobody had gotten around to fixing. And she found, to her own surprise, that it didn't bother her. It was noise that was doing something. It had purpose. She'd started walking the property in the early mornings before the household woke. Not because anyone had told her to, not because it served any function she'd identified yet, but because the habit of early rising was too deep to break, and the alternative was lying in bed listening to herself think, which was less productive. She walked the fence lines and the pastures and the spaces between the outbuildings, learning the layout the same way she'd learned the bakery, not from someone explaining it to her, but from her own feet and her own attention. It was on one of these mornings, maybe 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, that she found the fabric. It was in the far corner of the storage barn, behind a row of old saddle equipment, 3 bolts of cloth wrapped in oilskin and stacked against the wall. She almost walked past them. Then she stopped and crouched down and peeled back the oilskin edge. Good wool. A gray blue, a dark brown, and something that might have been cream once and was still serviceable. She had no idea where they'd come from or how long they'd been there. She put the oilskin back, made a note in her head, and walked back to the house. She brought it up that evening, after supper. Ethan was at the other end of the table working through some papers, and she was doing the week's accounts, and she said, without preamble, "There are 3 bolts of cloth in the storage barn." He looked up. "Behind the saddle gear. Good wool. Did you know about it?" "Vaguely," he said. "My mother left some things when she went east. I never sorted through the storage properly." Clara considered this. "Would you mind if I used it?" He looked at her for a moment. "For the dresses?" "For a start." He went back to his papers. "Do whatever you want with it." It was not, she thought, the most enthusiastic endorsement she'd ever received, but it was permission, and permission was what she needed. She got the fabric out the next morning before anyone was up, spread the bolts on the kitchen table, and ran her hands along the weave, checking the hand of it, the give, whether it had held up in storage. The gray blue was the best, dense and consistent with a slight nap that would hold a pressed seam beautifully. The brown was slightly moth-touched at one edge, but there was enough good cloth left. The cream needed to be washed before she could properly assess it. She'd folded it all back up and put it in her room before the hands arrived for breakfast. She didn't rush it. That had been the mistake at 16, bringing something out too fast, before it was ready, into a space that wasn't ready for it. She worked on the first piece at night in her room, using a pattern she'd sketched specifically for the gray-blue wool. A woman's work dress, but done with some intention behind it. The shoulder line dropped to allow full movement, the waist fitted without being restrictive, the skirt cut with enough room that you could actually walk fast in it without taking small, mincing steps that slowed everything down. She made it for no one in particular. A shape in her head, average-sized, the kind of woman who had a long day in front of her and needed her clothes to work with her instead of against her. She was about halfway through when Lyle Whitaker became a direct problem rather than a background one. It happened at the water pump on a Thursday morning. Clara had been speaking with one of the other hands, a younger man named Sam, who was quiet and efficient and had recently started asking her occasional questions about the accounts, which she'd answered directly because there was no reason not to. She didn't particularly think of it as anything other than conversation. Lyle apparently thought differently. "You're keeping the bookkeeper company, Sam?" His voice came from behind them, carrying that tone people use when they want to say something cutting while maintaining the technical option of having meant something innocent. Sam went still in the way that younger men go still around older ones who outrank them and have bad tempers. Clara turned. "Good morning, Lyle." "Morning." He looked at her in the way he always looked at her, measuring and dismissive in equal parts, like she was something that had shown up on the property without being properly authorized. "We need that water pump free. Some of us have work to do." "I was just finishing," Sam said quickly. "We both were," Clara said, and she made sure her voice didn't change because she'd learned a long time ago that the moment you let someone hear that they've gotten to you, you've handed them a tool. She picked up the bucket she'd filled and walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard Lyle say something to Sam in a low voice. She caught the word decorating and understood what he meant by it. She told Ethan that evening, not because she expected him to solve it, she wasn't built for that kind of expectation, but because it was information he should have about his own operation, and she'd decided early on that being direct with him was more efficient than performing a version of herself that had no edges. Ethan listened without expression. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "How bad was it?" he said. "Not terrible, manageable, but it's the direction of it I'd rather cut off early." He nodded slowly. "I'll speak to him." "You don't have to make it a confrontation." "I know." He paused. "I'll speak to him." Whatever he said to Lyle, he said it without witnesses. Clara didn't know the specifics and didn't ask. What she noticed was that Lyle's particular brand of background commentary reduced itself to nothing for the following week, and though the cordiality was clearly surface level and not the beginning of any real peace between them, it was enough. Sometimes enough was what you were working with, and you took it and moved forward. She finished the dress on a Saturday night. She held it up in the lamplight and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't perfect. There was a section on the right shoulder seam where she'd had to unpick and redo it twice before it lay right, and the waistband was very slightly off grain in one section, which would bother her every time she looked at it, even though nobody else would ever notice. But it was solid. The line was what she'd intended it to be. The proportions worked. She put it on, looked at herself in the small square of mirror above the chest of drawers. The mirror was too small to see the whole thing at once, which meant she had to step back and piece the picture together from sections, which was an imperfect way to look at something. But even in sections, she could see that it worked. The shoulder line let her arms move naturally. The waist gave her shape without binding her. The skirt fell clean. She took it off, folded it, and set it on the chair. In the morning, she got back to work. The second piece went faster because the first had shaken some rust out of her hands and reminded them what they were doing. This one was for a smaller woman, narrower through the shoulders, shorter in the torso, and she was using the brown wool with the moth-touched edge carefully, cutting around the damage in a way that asked her to rethink the original pattern, which led her to a seam placement she wouldn't have arrived at otherwise, and which she thought was actually better. November came in cold and busy. The fall cattle work kept every hand on the property occupied from before light until dark, and Clara found herself doing double duty. The accounts during the quieter parts of the day, the sewing in the evenings, and in between, the general domestic maintenance of the house that she'd taken on without anyone asking simply because she noticed what needed doing and did it. She and Ethan had settled into a functional rhythm that was easier than she'd expected and more complicated in other ways. They were not strangers anymore. They were also not what anyone watching from outside would probably call close. They talked. They talked about the ranch, about the accounts, about the Harmon contract and the Henderson situation, and the questions Sam was asking about the books, and whether it might be worth letting Sam learn the system so there was a backup if Clara needed to be elsewhere doing something else. They talked about practical things in a practical register, and it was good. It worked. But sometimes, not often, the conversation went somewhere else. One evening in early November, a week after the main cattle push had ended and the ranch had settled back into its regular rhythm, Ethan came in from the barn later than usual and sat down at the kitchen table and looked like a man who had been carrying something all day and had not yet figured out where to put it down. Clara had been at the accounts. She looked at him and then looked back at the ledger. "Bad day," she said. It wasn't a question. "Lost a calf. Dam's not doing well." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Might lose her too." "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but it was the shrug of a man who wasn't actually shrugging it off. "It happens. Still costs something." He looked at her. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "You're the first person I've said that to in a while that didn't immediately tell me how to feel about it." Clara thought about what to say to that and decided not to overthink it. "How do you feel about it?" "Tired," he said, "and frustrated. And it's one calf, which I know it's not the ranch falling down. But it's one more thing on a day that had a lot of things." He paused. "That sounds smaller than I meant it to." "It doesn't sound small," Clara said. "It sounds true." He looked at her again with that expression she'd started to recognize. Not quite surprised, more like someone who had calibrated themselves for less than what they were getting. They sat in the kitchen for a while after that, not talking much, and it was not uncomfortable. That itself felt like something, though Clara couldn't have said exactly what. December brought the letter. She recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope before she'd even fully registered picking it up off the front table. She'd set it aside twice before she opened it, which said something about how well she understood her own feelings, or at least how well she understood that she wanted to choose the right moment rather than let the letter choose it for her. When she read it, the first thing she felt was a familiar tiredness. The second thing she felt was anger, which surprised her less. Thomas Whitmore wrote in the dignified tone he employed when he was asking for something he believed he was owed. The bakery was struggling without her, he wrote. He wrote that Nora's new husband had his own household to manage and couldn't assist. He wrote that Iris was young and not suited to the physical demands. He wrote that he was her father and he was asking her to consider her obligations. He wrote, with the particular indirectness of a man who understood exactly how direct he was being, that she might come back, that an arrangement with Blackwood could perhaps be reconsidered, that the judge could be spoken to. Clara folded the letter and put it on the table and sat with it for a while. She thought about the bakery, she thought about the storage room and the flour sacks and the feel of that room at 4 a.m, and she thought about the way her father had stood in the doorway the morning she'd left, watching her load her own trunks into Otis's wagon, and she thought about every version of this conversation she'd had in her head over the years. The one where she said what she actually thought, the one where she listed the inventory of what she'd given and what she'd received in return, the one where she cried, the one where she simply walked away. She hadn't walked away. She'd kept baking the bread. She didn't do that anymore. She brought the letter to Ethan that evening. She set it on the table in front of him without saying anything, and he read it. When he was done, he looked up. "He wants you back," Ethan said. "Yes." "Do you want to go back?" "No." He nodded. His expression had gone the way it went when he was considering something carefully. Not closed off, but inward. "What do you want to do about the letter?" "I want to write back," Clara said. "I want to tell him no, directly, which is something I've never done before." She paused. "And then I want to be done with it." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You should do exactly that." She wrote the letter that night. It was not a long letter, and it was not a cruel one, but it was the most honest thing she'd ever put on paper with her own name at the bottom. She told her father that she was not coming back to the bakery. She told him that she wished him well, and she meant it, the way you can mean something and also be finished with it at the same time. She told him that Nora and Iris were grown women who were capable of more than he'd ever asked them to be, and that perhaps now was the time to discover that. She sealed it and gave it to Otis to take into town with the supply list in the morning. Then she went back to the brown wool dress, which had 3 more seams to go, and she sat down and picked up her needle and kept working, and outside the night was cold and clear, and the ranch settled into its own quiet sounds, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Clara felt the particular satisfaction of a door closing on something that she had chosen to close, rather than something that had been shut in her face. She was still working when she heard Ethan's boots on the floor of the hallway, heading to his own room, and then silence. She turned the seam, pressed it flat with her thumbnail, and moved on to the next. The brown wool dress was finished by the second week of December, and Clara hung it on the peg behind her door and looked at it every morning when she got up, and every night before she went to sleep. Not out of vanity, but out of the particular relationship a maker has with a made thing, checking it, assessing it, finding the places where it fell short of what she'd intended, and filing those notes away for next time. There would be a next time. She knew that now in a way she hadn't let herself know before. Word got around the way word gets around in a place where not much else is happening. She hadn't told anyone she was sewing. She hadn't shown anyone the dresses. But a ranch with 12 hands was not a private place, and Otis had apparently mentioned something to someone in town during one of his supply runs, and by mid-December, Clara received a visit she hadn't anticipated. The woman's name was Ruth Geller. She was the wife of a cattle broker who worked the same county roads as the Blackwood operation, and she arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a buggy she drove herself, which Clara respected before she'd said a single word to her. Clara came out to meet her in the yard. Ruth Geller was somewhere in her mid-30s, with the practical, assessing quality of a woman who had spent years managing more than most people gave her credit for. She looked at Clara the way Clara had looked at the wool bolts, checking the actual material, not the surface of it. "You're the Whitmore girl," she said. "Clara Blackwood now," Clara said, not aggressively, just for accuracy. Ruth Geller accepted the correction with a small nod. "I heard you've been sewing," working dresses, among other things. I'd like to see them. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Come inside." She brought out both finished pieces, the gray-blue wool and the brown, and laid them on the kitchen table. Ruth Geller looked at them without touching them first, the way experienced people look at things they're serious about. Then she picked up the gray-blue and ran her thumb along the shoulder seam and held the skirt section up to check the fall. "You did this yourself," she said. "Yes." "Where did you train?" "I didn't. I read a book and taught myself." Ruth looked up at that. Something shifted in her expression. Not skepticism, exactly, more like a recalculation. "This seam work is better than the dressmaker in Caldwell," she said. Caldwell was the nearest town of any real size, a full day's ride east. "And she trained in St. Louis." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "I want one," Ruth said. "The gray-blue, this style. I'll pay you properly, and I'll tell people where it came from." This was, Clara understood, an offer that went beyond a single dress. Ruth Geller moved in circles that Clara did not move in, knew people across 3 counties, and had the particular social currency of a woman whom other women trusted for recommendations. What she was offering, under the surface of the transaction, was an introduction. "I'll need your measurements," Clara said. "And some time. I'd say 3 weeks." "4 is fine," Ruth said. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm just particular." She stayed for coffee. They talked about fabric sources, which Ruth knew better than Clara did, having purchased cloth for her household for years. She mentioned a dry goods merchant in Caldwell who carried imported wool, and a fabric agent who passed through the territory twice a year with bolts from the east. She gave Clara this information matter-of-factly, as one practical person gives useful information to another, and Clara absorbed it and said thank you without making a production of it. After Ruth Geller left, Clara sat for a while at the kitchen table. She heard Ethan come in through the back, boot heels on the floorboards, the particular sequence of sounds that meant he'd been out at the east pasture, mud on his boots, the specific weight of his step when he was tired from that particular stretch of fence work. He came into the kitchen and saw her expression. "Who was that?" he said. "Ruth Geller, Jim Geller's wife." He went to pour himself water. "What did she want?" "A dress." Clara paused. "And I think she's going to tell people about it." Ethan turned. He looked at her in the way that had become familiar. Direct. No particular performance in it. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "The last time I showed people what I made, it didn't go the way I'd hoped." "This isn't the last time." "No." He drank his water, set the cup down. "Geller's wife has a long reach socially. If she likes what you make, you'll have more orders than you know what to do with by spring." "That's what I'm trying to decide if I'm ready for." He leaned against the counter. "What's the worst that happens?" Clara thought about it. "They come, and I'm not good enough, and I end up exactly where I was before." "Where's that?" "Back in the flour." She said it flat, without self-pity, because it was just a fact she was naming. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You're better than the flour, Clara." She looked at him. He looked back at her and didn't qualify it or walk it back, just let it sit there as the stated position it was. She felt something move in her chest that she didn't entirely want to examine in the middle of the kitchen in the afternoon light. "I'll make the dress," she said. She made Ruth Geller's dress in 3 weeks and 4 days. She made it out of the gray-blue wool and a small amount of cream trim that Ruth had sent along with a note indicating where she'd like it placed, which Clara read and then set aside and used her own judgment, because the note had been offered as a suggestion rather than a directive, and Clara's own judgment was better. The finished dress was the best thing she'd made yet. She knew it looking at it with the same certainty she applied to the accounts. Not arrogance, just an accurate reading of the evidence. Ruth Geller came to collect it in early January, tried it on in Clara's room with the door closed, and came back out wearing an expression that was contained but satisfied. "What do I owe you?" she said. Clara gave her the number. Ruth paid without negotiating, which was itself a kind of statement. I'm going to the Aldridge dinner in Caldwell on the 14th, Ruth said. She was putting her coat back on. There will be about 20 women there, and most of them have been wearing the same 3 dresses since last Easter. She paused at the door. I'll be wearing this one. She left. Clara stood in the hallway of the ranch house, listening to the buggy move away down the road, and thought that the shape of things was changing, and she wasn't sure yet where the new shape was going to land. January moves slowly, the way January does in that part of the territory, where the cold is not spectacular, but it is thorough and patient, and it gets into everything. The ranch contracted in on itself the way ranches do in winter. Less movement, more maintenance, the days spent on repair and preparation rather than the larger work that the warm months required. Ethan spent more time in the house. Clara spent more time at the sewing. They had more evenings of conversation than they'd had before, because winter gave them back hours that the rest of the year consumed. They talked about the spring planning, about whether to expand the east herd, about a dispute with a neighboring landowner named Fitch, who claimed a section of fence line had been moved, which it hadn't been, and which Ethan intended to prove. They talked about Sam, who had gotten good enough with the accounts that Claire had handed him the weekly ledgers with confidence and was using the time to focus on the sewing. They talked one evening about what Clara wanted. It came up sideways, the way honest conversations sometimes do, not because either of them planned it, but because there was a particular quality to that evening, the fire burning down to coals and the house settled into its nighttime sounds, and something in the atmosphere had the slightly loosened quality of a moment where real things get said. "Do you miss the town?" Ethan asked. He was looking at the fire, not at her. Clara considered. "I miss certain things, the proximity of it, being able to walk somewhere. We're not that far from Dust Creek." "I know, it's not a complaint." She looked at her hands in her lap, the needles she'd set down. "I don't miss the life I had in it. I miss the idea of it, the version I used to think it might become." He looked at her then. "What version was that?" "One where I had something of my own, something that was mine because I'd built it, not because it was what was left after everyone else took what they wanted." She said it carefully, measuring the words, not because she was being evasive, but because she was trying to be precise. A shop, maybe. Somewhere women could come for clothing that actually fit them and actually worked for their lives. The fire shifted. Ethan looked back at it. "That's not a small thing you're describing," he said. "I know. You'd need capital, a space." "I know that too." He was quiet for a long moment. "The Caldwell Road property," he said, and then stopped. Clara waited. "I own a building on the east end of the main road through Caldwell. Inherited it with the ranch. My father bought it as an investment and never did anything with it. I've been paying taxes on an empty building for 6 years." He said it with the flat practicality of a man recounting an inefficiency. "It's not large, but it's solid and it's in the right location." Clara looked at him. "I'm not saying it would be without cost," he said. "It would need work before it was usable, and Caldwell is a full day's ride." "I heard you the first time," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but there was something happening in her chest that was less steady. "Are you offering me the building?" "I'm telling you it exists and that it's not being used for anything, and that if you had a plan for it, I'd listen to the plan." This was, she understood, how Ethan Blackwood said things that other people would have said differently, with more ceremony, more sentiment, more obvious architecture. He didn't have that. What he had was direct and unembellished and entirely genuine, and she had learned to hear it for what it was. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take your time." She thought about it for 3 days, and then she stopped thinking and started drawing. Not dresses this time, but layouts, floor plans, the spatial logic of a workspace that would need to accommodate fittings and fabric storage, and a working area and a place where women could sit while they waited or made decisions about their orders. She'd never designed a space before, but she approached it the same way she approached the accounts and the dresses and everything else, with attention and without assuming she needed someone else to do it for her. She showed Ethan the drawings on a Thursday evening. He looked at them with the same focused attention he gave to everything she put in front of him. He asked 2 questions about the dimensions. He pointed out that the building's east wall had a water issue he'd been meaning to address, and which would need to be resolved before the space was usable. He said he thought the layout made sense, and that the storage section might benefit from being larger than she'd drawn it. "You've thought about this," Claire said. "I looked at the building last time I was in Caldwell, 2 weeks ago." He said it as though this were not significant. "You went and looked at it." "I was in Caldwell anyway." She looked at him. He looked at the drawings. "Ethan." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when a thing was settled, and looked back down at the drawings. 2 weeks later, Thomas Whitmore arrived at the ranch. Clara was in the side yard hanging washing when Otis came around the corner of the barn with an expression that said something was happening that he didn't know what to do with. She followed his gaze to the main road and saw the wagon, and she recognized the horse before she recognized the figure on the seat, and she took a slow breath and dried her hands on her apron and walked to the yard gate. Her father looked the same, older, maybe, but that could have been the winter light. He climbed down from the wagon with the slightly stiff movement of a man who had sat for 12 miles and was pretending he hadn't, and he stood in the road and looked at her. "Clara," he said. "Father." She didn't open the gate. "You should have written." "I wrote." "You wrote back." He paused. "I thought a conversation made more sense." She looked at him for a moment. He was doing the thing he did, composing himself into a posture of reasonableness that was designed to make any resistance on her part look like the unreasonable position. She'd grown up inside this dynamic. She knew every angle of it. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." She put him at the kitchen table and made the coffee and sat down across from him and waited. He looked around the kitchen, taking inventory the way he always took inventory, not openly approving or disapproving, just noting, gathering information. "It's a good property," he said. "Yes." "Blackwood's done well for himself." "Yes." He turned his eyes to her. "You look better than I expected." "Were you expecting something specific?" "I was concerned," he said, with the tone of a man who has rehearsed being concerned. "You left in a hurry. You didn't know this man." "I knew enough." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The bakery is suffering, Clara." "I know. You said so in your letter." "Nora's husband has his own concerns. Iris is—" He shook his head. "She's trying, but she's not you." "I know that too." "Then you know why I came." Clara looked at her father. She looked at him clearly, without the layer of emotion she'd always had to manage through before. The old mixture of wanting his approval and knowing she'd never fully receive it in the form she actually needed. The guilt of being the one who could do the work, and therefore the one who was expected to keep doing it forever, without question. She looked at him and she felt something that surprised her with its quietness. Not anger, not grief. Something more like the feeling at the end of a long task. The particular exhale of something completed. "I'm not coming back," she said. "That's not going to change." "Clara." "Let me finish." Her voice was even. "You built something in Dust Creek, and I helped you keep it alive for a long time, and I'm not sorry I did that. But the arrangement wasn't honest. I did the work, and you never once said it was worth anything, because you were too busy measuring worth by things that had nothing to do with work." Thomas's face did several things in quick succession. "I'm not angry at you," Clara said. "I was for a while. I'm not anymore. But I'm also not going back. Nora and Iris will figure it out, or you'll hire someone, or the bakery will change into something different than what it is now. Those are all possible outcomes, and they don't require me." The back door opened and Ethan came in. He'd been at the barn. Clara had seen him there when she'd walked her father inside. But now he stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his work coat, and looked at Thomas Whitmore with a steady and not especially warm expression. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. Not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. Thomas stood up from the table. Clara watched her father look at Ethan, assessing him the way he assessed everything, calculating. And then she watched her father understand something, reading it in the way Ethan was standing and the way Ethan was looking at him, and perhaps in something about the kitchen itself, the arrangement of it, the way two people's presence occupies a shared space when it belongs to both of them. Thomas looked at Clara. "You're settled," he said. The word came out flatter than she thought he'd intended. "Yes," she said. "I am." Her father set down his cup. He straightened his coat. He was a man who needed to maintain a certain posture in a room, and she could see him doing the work of maintaining it now against more resistance than he'd expected. "I'll tell Iris you're well," he said. "Please do." He nodded to Ethan, who nodded back once. Minimal. And then Thomas Whitmore walked back through the house and out the front door and down to his wagon, and Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched him go. She heard Ethan move behind her, the sound of him pouring himself coffee. "You handled that," he said. "Eventually." She turned from the window. "I should have handled it years ago." "You handled it when you were ready to." She looked at him. He was looking at her over the rim of his cup, and there was something in his face that had been there for a while now, like something she'd been cataloging in the way she cataloged things she didn't yet have the right words for. It was not complicated. It was not hidden. It was just there, patient and unhurried, the same way Ethan Blackwood was patient and unhurried about most things that mattered. She picked up her own cup and sat back down at the table and looked at the drawings of the Caldwell building that were still spread across one end of it. "When the ground thaws," she said, "I'd like to go to Caldwell and look at the building." "I'll take you," he said. Outside, her father's wagon made its way back down the road toward Dust Creek, and the sound of it faded and the ranch settled back into its own sounds, and Clara sat at the table and felt the weight of the last few months settle somewhere it could be carried differently. Not dropped, because some things don't drop entirely, but redistributed into a shape that didn't press the same place as it used to. She picked up a pencil and started adjusting the storage layout. The space needed to be larger, the way Ethan had said. He was right about that. She made the correction and moved on to the next thing. The ground thawed in March, earlier than anyone expected. Clara noticed it first on a Wednesday morning during her walk. The way the soil gave differently underfoot. The mud and mineral smell that came up when winter's grip loosened. The sound of water moving again in the drainage ditch along the east fence line. She stood there for a moment just listening to it, that specific sound of land reasserting itself, and then she went back inside and told Ethan the ground had thawed. He looked at her over his coffee. "I know. You said when the ground thawed. I said I'd take you to Caldwell." "I know what you said." He set down the cup. Saturday. They left early Saturday morning in the ranch wagon, which was practical if not comfortable, with Otis driving and Clara and Ethan sitting in the bed on the supply boxes because the bench seat only fit two. It was a cold, clear morning with the sky a hard, pale blue that meant the weather was going to hold, and the 12 miles to Caldwell passed mostly in quiet, which was fine. Clara had the drawings with her, rolled and tucked under her arm, and she sat with them and looked at the passing land and thought about proportions. Caldwell was larger than Dust Creek, in the way that a working town grows larger than a trading post. It had accrued institutions, a proper bank and a hotel, and 3 streets of commercial buildings instead of 1, and the foot traffic on a Saturday morning had a purposeful quality that Dust Creek's never quite managed. Clara looked at it as they came down the main road and thought, yes, this is the right place for it. The building was at the east end of the main road, set between a harness shop and a dry goods merchant. It was not large. The front was 2 windows and a door, and the interior, when Ethan unlocked it, was dim and smelled of dust and old wood and 6 years of sitting empty. But the bones of it were what she'd hoped for. A good front room with decent light from those 2 windows, a back room that could serve as the working space and storage, a ceiling high enough that the front room wouldn't feel cramped once it had furniture and people in it. She walked it twice while Ethan stood near the door watching her. Then she unrolled the drawings and held them up against the actual space, checking the layout she'd planned against the reality of the room. "The water problem is the east wall," she said. "There's a section near the floor. The foundation shifted slightly. It's not structural, but it lets moisture in during heavy rain. I've got someone who can fix it." "When?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Clara walked the east wall, crouching to look at the section he meant. It was a crack, not dramatic, the kind of thing that had been manageable and then ignored until it was a problem. She could see the old water staining on the plaster above it. 3 weeks, she said, and then I want to paint this room. Ethan looked at the walls, which were a dingy gray-yellow that had probably once been white. All right. Not white. Something warmer. He didn't ask her to be more specific. She appreciated that. She paced the front room once more, placed herself in the center of it, and tried to see it not as it was, but as it would be. The fitting area near the windows where the light was good, the display space along the left wall, the chairs for waiting. She could see it. She'd been seeing it for weeks in her head, and now standing in the actual room, the vision and the reality were close enough that the gap between them felt crossable. I want to open by June, she said. Ethan's expression didn't change, but she'd gotten good enough at reading him to catch the small upward adjustment that meant he was recalculating something. That's 3 months. I know. Is there a problem with 3 months? There's a lot to do in 3 months. I'm aware of that too. She turned to look at him. The repairs, the paint, sourcing fabric. I'll need a proper work table and a good mirror and at minimum 4 yards of display cloth. I've already written to the fabric agent Ruth Geller mentioned, the one who passes through in spring, and he'll be in Caldwell in April. She paused. 3 months is enough if I start now. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, all right, June. They ate lunch at the hotel because it was there and they were hungry, and it was the first time Clara had sat across a table from Ethan in a public room rather than their own kitchen, and there was something strange and interesting about seeing him in that context. The way the room's other occupants registered him, the quiet authority he carried without performing it, the way the hotel's proprietor came over personally to greet him rather than sending a server. You have some standing in this town, Clara said after the proprietor left. I've done business here a long time. That's not quite what I mean. He looked at her. People pay attention to you, she said, not because you make them, just because you're present in a way that registers. She was aware this was an observation she hadn't planned to make aloud, but she'd made it, and there it was. Ethan looked at his plate. There was something almost uncomfortable in his expression, which was unusual enough that she noted it. My father was the same way, he said. I used to think it was something he did deliberately. It took me a while to understand it was just what happens when you mean what you say and do what you commit to. He paused. Most people don't, so the ones who do stand out. Clara thought about that. That's a fairly simple formula. Most things are when you're standing at a distance from them. She looked at him across the table and thought, not for the first time, but with more clarity than before, that whatever this was between them had been building in the patient, unhurried way that solid things build. Not a sudden event, an accumulation. The evenings and the ledgers and the letters and the conversations and the silences and the fact that he had gone to Caldwell on his own 2 weeks ago and looked at an empty building because she had said she wanted something of her own. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not admired from a distance. That was different, that was performance and projection, but actually seen. The particular act of another person paying attention to what you are rather than what they've decided you are. She'd thought she didn't need it. She'd spent years constructing a version of herself that ran on self-sufficiency alone because the alternative was needing something she wasn't sure she'd get. But there it was. Ethan Blackwood had looked at a sketchbook in a lamplit room and seen a real thing, and it had mattered to her in a way she hadn't been fully prepared for, and she was done pretending it hadn't. I want to say something, she said. He looked up. I know this arrangement began as a practical agreement, and I know we've both treated it that way, it was the right way to start. I'm not saying it wasn't. She wasn't nervous exactly, but she was aware of the care required to say this correctly, to not over-embellish or undersay it. But I don't experience it as a practical arrangement anymore. And I think you don't either, and I'd rather say that plainly than keep navigating around it. Ethan was very still for a moment. Then he said, No, I don't experience it that way either. They looked at each other across the table. All right, Clara said. All right, he said. It was not, she would think later, a romantic declaration by any measure that the word typically implies. There were no dramatic gestures, and nobody said anything that would sound meaningful repeated to someone else. But it was honest, and it was mutual, and it was theirs, and that counted for more in her reckoning than poetry would have. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the sun low and orange behind them, and Otis drove, and neither of them said much. And Clara sat with the rolled drawings in her arms and felt the particular quality of a day that had moved something forward. The next 3 months were the hardest and most energizing she could remember. The repairs on the east wall took longer than 3 weeks. They took 5, because when the mason opened up the section, he found the damage went further than the surface had suggested, which was the way of things with problems that have been quietly progressing in the dark. Clara absorbed this without spiraling. She adjusted the timeline, wrote to the fabric agent asking him to hold her order 1 more week, and spent the extra time finishing 2 more pieces and beginning correspondence with 3 women in Caldwell whom Ruth Geller had mentioned as potential customers. Ruth remained, in her contained and practical way, Clara's most useful ally. She mentioned the shop to people she knew. She wore the gray-blue dress to 3 separate events and told anyone who commented on it exactly where it had come from and when the shop was opening. She did this without fanfare, as a simple matter of factual reporting, which was in some ways more effective than enthusiasm would have been. Ruth Geller didn't embellish, so when she said something was good, people believed her. By the time the east wall was repaired and the room was painted, a warm cream that turned the light of those 2 front windows into something almost golden, Clara had 4 orders waiting and 2 more tentative inquiries. She'd sourced the fabric from the spring agent and 2 additional suppliers Ruth had connected her to. She had a work table built by the ranch's most competent carpenter, a man named Burl, who worked slowly and precisely and produced a table that was level and solid and exactly the dimensions she'd specified. She moved her things into the shop space in mid-May, making 3 trips from the ranch with Ethan driving. On the 3rd trip, she brought the 2 finished dresses she'd been keeping at the ranch, the gray-blue wool and the brown, and hung them on the wall hooks in the front room as the only display she had so far. She stood back and looked at them. They were imperfect. She could see every place where her technique had been still developing, the seam she'd redone twice, the waistband that sat slightly off grain. She could see all of it. But they were there, on a wall, in a room with her name on the paper she'd filed with the county office, and that reality had its own weight that overrode the imperfections. "How does it feel?" Ethan asked. He was standing just inside the door, hat in his hands. "Strange," she said. "Good strange." He looked around the room. "You need a sign." "I know. I'm having it made. It'll be ready next week." He nodded. He walked over to the wall where the dresses hung and stood looking at them, and she stood beside him looking at them, and neither of them said anything for a minute. "The brown one's better than when you started," he said. "They're both better than when I started." "I know, but the brown one especially." He paused. "There's something in the cut of it, the way it moves." Clara looked at it. "I had to reroute the whole pattern when I found the moth damage. Cut around the bad sections. Sometimes you get there differently than you planned." She looked at him. He was still looking at the dress, and she thought that he probably didn't know how precisely that statement described the entire arc of the last 6 months. Or maybe he did, and was choosing the indirect form of saying it, which was very much in character. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes you do." The shop opened on a Tuesday in the first week of June, which was not a dramatic day by anyone's external measure. No ribbon cutting, no ceremony. Clara unlocked the front door at 8 in the morning and stood behind the work table she'd set up in the front room and waited. Her first customer that morning was a woman named Margaret Hollis, the wife of a Caldwell merchant, who had heard about the shop from Ruth and had come in with the particular manner of someone who had been wanting new clothes for a long time and had decided this was finally worth investigating. She was a solid, short woman in her 40s with wide shoulders and the practical frustration of someone for whom standard dress patterns consistently failed. Clara measured her carefully. She asked questions about her daily work, what she needed to be able to do without restriction, whether she had preferences about necklines. She listened to the answers instead of moving on after the first sentence. When Margaret Hollis left 90 minutes later with a deposit paid and a fitting scheduled in 3 weeks, she stopped at the door and said, "You actually listened." Clara looked up. "The dressmaker in Caldwell, the other one, she measures you and then goes off and makes whatever she was already planning to make and calls it custom." Margaret's expression carried years of accumulated mild outrage about this. "You actually listened to what I said about the shoulders." "The shoulders are the functional center of how a dress works," Clara said. If they're wrong, nothing else compensates. Margaret Hollis stood in the doorway for a moment. I'm going to send my daughter-in-law. I'd appreciate that. She's tall, long in the torso. Nothing ever fits right in the waist. I can work with that. Margaret left. Clara turned back to the work table and wrote up the order notes from the fitting while they were still precise in her head, and then she sat down and looked out the front windows at the Caldwell Main Road going about its Tuesday morning business, and she felt something she was going to have to find a better word for eventually, because satisfied wasn't quite right. It was larger than satisfied, and more complicated, and had a texture to it that included the flower and the sketchbooks, and the storage room and Ethan's face in the lamplight, and her father's wagon going back down the road, and all of it, the whole long accumulation of it, distilled into this Tuesday morning and a woman's shoulders fitting correctly. By the end of June, she had 11 orders. By August, she had more work than she could manage alone, which was a problem she addressed by hiring a young woman named Della, who was 17 and had been doing alterations work for the other dressmaker in Caldwell and was clearly more capable than the work she was being given. Clara sat with her for an afternoon, looked at what she could do, and offered her a wage that was better than what she was getting and a work environment that would actually develop her skills. Della accepted and showed up the next morning with her own scissors and a leather roll, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how seriously she took the work. The shop became a place where women talked to each other. Clara hadn't entirely planned this. She'd planned a workspace, a functional commercial operation. But it turned out that the act of actually listening to what women needed and treating those needs as legitimate rather than frivolous had a particular magnetic quality in a town and a time where that wasn't the default. Women came in for fittings and stayed to talk. They brought friends. They compared notes on suppliers and fabric choices and the specific practical challenges of their lives that clothing either helped or complicated. It was not a social club. It functioned as a business with clear exchange and transaction, but it had a quality of, she thought about the word for it and landed on dignity. A quality of dignity, of taking women seriously as people with real bodies and real requirements and real lives worth dressing well. Ruth Geller came in one afternoon in August and sat in one of the waiting chairs and watched Della finish a sleeve alteration, and Clara talk a customer through a pattern choice, and after the customer left, Ruth said, "You've built something real here." Clara was writing up an order. "I'm aware." "I mean in the larger sense, not just the business." Ruth looked around the room. "There's something happening in this room that isn't just commerce." Clara set down her pencil. She looked at the space she'd created, the warm walls and the good light, and Della working with calm focus at the table and the dresses on their hooks, and the smell of clean fabric and chalk, and the barely there sound of the main road outside. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the dresses on the ranch that first morning, honest and clear-eyed. "I know," she said. "I wanted it to be like this." "Did you think it would be?" Clara thought about standing in that square in Dust Creek with flour on her hands and the whole town's attention moving around her like water around a rock. She thought about the merchant's wife who had looked at her dresses and said, pleasantly, "Who do you imagine is going to buy a dress from you?" She thought about the storage room and the sketchbook behind the flour sacks, and every night she'd worked on something real in secret because real things kept getting laughed at in the light. "No," she said honestly, "I didn't quite think it would be, but I knew I had to try it anyway." Ruth nodded, like that was the answer she'd expected. "Most people don't," she said. "Try it anyway. They wait until they're sure it'll work, and of course the certainty never comes, and so nothing ever happens." She paused. "You didn't wait." "I didn't have anything to lose by the time I got here," Clara said. "That's not quite true. You had your comfort, your known quantity. It's harder to give up a known quantity than people admit." Clara looked at her. Ruth Geller had a way of saying things with the clean precision of someone who had done her own private reckoning and arrived at her conclusions through real experience. Clara respected it. "You're right," Clara said. "It's harder." The Dust Creek matter came to a kind of natural ending in September. It was Iris who came, not Thomas. She arrived on a Saturday when Clara happened to be at the shop rather than the ranch, drove herself in a small buggy, and came through the door with the slightly uncertain posture of someone who has rehearsed less than they needed to. Clara looked at her. Iris, I didn't know if you'd be here, Iris said. She was looking around the room. This is nice. It's really nice. Sit down. Iris sat. She looked at Della, who nodded and continued working, and then she looked at her hands in her lap. Father sold the bakery. Clara was quiet for a moment. When? Last month. He sold it to the Hargreave family. They own the dry goods store on the other end of town. They're going to expand. Iris looked up. He's going to live with Nora and her husband, in their spare room. Clara thought about the bakery, the oven and the work table and the front room where Thomas had held court while she'd kept the fires going. It had been sold. It was somebody else's building now, somebody else's enterprise. She waited for the feeling that came with that, and what came was quieter than she'd expected. Not nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was more like the feeling of looking at a photograph of a place you lived once, the recognition without the pull. Are you all right? She asked Iris. Iris blinked. Me? Yes. Yes, I think so. Iris seemed surprised to be asked. It was strange the last week, packing things up. I didn't expect it to be strange, but it was. Things end strangely sometimes, even things you didn't love. Iris looked at her with an expression Clara recognized, because it was close to one she'd seen on her own face in the small square mirror in her room at the ranch, years ago. A young woman trying to understand how she arrived at where she was and where the next step actually went. I don't want to go back to Nora's house, Iris said. Her husband has opinions about everything, and Nora has started agreeing with all of them, and it feels like I'm living inside someone else's arrangement with no room for mine. Clara was quiet. Then, what do you want? I don't know yet. Iris said it with a directness that surprised Clara, the rawness of it, the admission of not knowing without immediately covering it with something else. That's the honest answer. I don't know yet. Clara looked at her sister for a long moment. Iris was 20 now, and the girl who'd stood in the yard on the morning Clara had left, asking if she was scared, was still visible inside the young woman sitting across from her. The hesitation, the reaching. Can you sew? Clara asked. Iris looked startled. A little. I mean, not like... She stopped. Not like this. She gestured at the shop. Della couldn't sew like this when she started. Clara paused. I'm not offering you anything yet. I'm asking if you can sew, because I might need someone else here eventually, and if you're willing to work and learn properly, it would be worth talking about. Iris stared at her. Think about it, Clara said, and don't say yes because it seems easier than the other options. Say yes if you actually want to learn the work. I won't carry you. I know that. Good. Iris left with something different in her posture than she'd come in with. Not certainty, not a plan fully formed, but the particular quality of someone who has been given a real question to sit with rather than a closed door to stand in front of. Clara watched her go from the front window and thought that whatever happened next with Iris would be Iris's doing, not hers. She could offer an opening. She could not do the walking through for anyone else. This, she had come to understand, was one of the things she knew now that she hadn't known at 23. That the most you can do for another person is show them the door exists. What they do with that information is entirely their own business. Ethan came into Caldwell the following Saturday, which he now did regularly. Not because the shop needed his attention, but because he had found, apparently, that he liked seeing what was being built there, liked the way the room looked when it was occupied and working. He came in on Saturday afternoon, sat in one of the waiting chairs for half an hour, talked to whoever was there, and then drove Clara back to the ranch while Della locked up. It was simple. It had the quality of something that didn't need embellishment. On this particular Saturday, after Della had gone and the last customer had left and Clara was closing up the work table for the week, she found him looking at the wall where she'd hung the most recent finished piece, a fall dress in dark green wool for a woman named Carlotta, who was coming to pick it up Monday. He was looking at it with genuine attention, the same way he'd looked at the sketchbook that first time, taking it seriously. The green is new, he said. I sourced it from the spring agent. It's from Ohio. She stood beside him. Carlotta has dark hair. The green will be good on her. You think about that when you're making it? Who it's for? Always. She looked at the dress. I think about what her actual life looks like, what she needs the dress to do, and then I think about what would make her feel like herself in it, not just covered. She paused. Those two things aren't always the same, but they're not incompatible. He looked at her. That's the whole philosophy, I suppose, she said. If there is one. That function and dignity aren't opposites, that you don't have to choose between a life that works and a life that feels like it belongs to you. She stopped, slightly surprised at having said that much. That's not just about dresses, Ethan said. No, she agreed. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, are you happy, Clara? She looked at him. He was asking it the way he asked everything important, plainly, without softening it into something more comfortable, leaving the question open and clear. She thought about the bakery and the flour sacks and the sketchbook behind the storage room wall. She thought about standing in that square and being the one the crowd's attention moved around. She thought about the letter she'd written her father with her own name at the bottom, and the particular feeling of that door closing. She thought about Ethan looking at her sketchbook with actual attention, and the Caldwell building with its east wall problem, and Della's leather roll of scissors, and Margaret Hollis's shoulders, and the green dress on the wall. She thought about how happiness was not, in her experience, a destination you arrived at and then stayed in. It was more like the ground under your feet, something you had to keep choosing to stand on, something that required your weight and your presence and your willingness to stay, even when parts of it were still soft and uneven. Yes, she said. Not perfectly. Not all the way through, the way people pretend it is, but in the places that matter, yes. He nodded. That small nod of a thing settled. Good, he said. They closed up the shop and walked out into the September evening, Ethan locking the door behind them, the sign above it clean and readable in the last light. Clara stood on the step for a moment and looked up the main road of Caldwell, the business of a Saturday evening moving through it, the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of a town at the end of its week. She thought about something she'd read once, in that book she'd borrowed and never returned when she was 14, a line that had stuck to her in the way that lines stick when they find something in you that was already waiting for them. It had said, roughly, that the making of anything real requires the willingness to begin before you're certain and to keep going after the certainty still doesn't come. She hadn't understood it fully at 14. She understood it now. The people who had laughed at her dresses when she was 16 had not been wrong about the dresses. The dresses had been imperfect, and she had been unskilled, and the laughter, in some narrow technical sense, had been responding to a real deficiency. What they had been wrong about, catastrophically, consequentially wrong, was the conclusion they drew from it. That deficiency now meant deficiency always, that where she was determined where she would stay, that a person who couldn't yet do something was a person who could never do it, and should stop trying and know her place and be what the world had decided she was. The world had done this to her, and she had, for years, done it to herself. Had folded up the sketches and put them away, and baked the bread, and taken up the space that was allotted, and been grateful for the allotment because at least it was certain. And then one day a quiet man with no interest in performing anything had stood in front of her in a town square and said, "I choose her." And she had said, "You sure about that?" And he had said yes, and everything that had seemed sealed had turned out to be merely latched. That was the thing she wanted to hold on to, she thought. Not the romance of it. The romance was real, but it was not the lesson. The lesson was smaller and more specific and more useful, that sometimes what stands between a person and their life is not circumstance or capacity or even genuine external opposition, but simply the accumulated weight of other people's settled opinions about who you are. And those opinions feel like walls because they are, in their way. They take up space. They create resistance. They shape the room you think you're allowed to occupy. But they are not load-bearing. They come down. Ethan had come down off the step and was waiting by the wagon. He looked back at her, patient in the way he always was, not rushing her, not asking what she was thinking. She came down the step. They drove back to the ranch in the early dark, the road familiar under the wheels, the land doing its quiet September work around them. The stars were coming out, first one and then many, and the air had the particular cold, clean quality of a fall evening that is not yet winter. Clara sat beside Ethan on the wagon seat and thought about the brown wool dress with the reroaded pattern, the one he'd said was better than when she'd started. She thought about how she'd had to cut around the damaged sections, and the reroading had led her somewhere better than the original plan. Sometimes you get there differently than you planned. The ranch came into view ahead of them, the lights of it visible through the dark, and Clara Whitmore Blackwood looked at it the way she had learned to look at all the things that were hers now, with the clear eyes of someone who knew exactly what it had cost and had paid it and found the price fair. She was not the girl nobody saw anymore. She was not rescued. She was not transformed by love or luck into something she hadn't been before. She was exactly who she had always been, underneath the flower and the borrowed sketchbook and the folded-up years of making herself smaller. A woman who knew how to look at a broken thing and figure out how to fix it, who could read a ledger and a seam allowance with equal precision, who had enough stubbornness to keep going after the room told her to stop. She had always been this. She had simply been waiting for enough space to become it. The wagon rolled into the yard. Otis took the horse. Clara stepped down with her bag over one shoulder and walked toward the house, and Ethan walked beside her, and the door opened into the warm and ordinary interior of their life, and she stepped inside and did not look back.